Um,
Sure.
just want to acknowledge the folks who make our programming possible. You see their logos here. These are the sponsors of our ECHO chapter, and just a special shout out Avuity, MCOR, Hickson, Colliers, and BHDP. Thank you so much for your continued partnership and sponsorship of our chapter and the programming that we bring to you each and every month and throughout the year. Looking forward to today's conversation with Andrew Urban at Colliers International. And Andrew, appreciate your willingness to speak with us this morning and bring us in on some of the things that you're working on and seeing in your world. And thank you for the time and insights you're about to provide to us. So, Andrew, over to
Sure.
you.
Sure. Thanks, Chad, and thanks to the audience and CoreNet and IKO chapter for continuing to support this programming, as well as all the sponsors that step up. I'm going to share my screen here, and today we're going to talk about a topic that's kind of interesting, I think, from a number of levels, right? And so very often when we talk about real estate, we talk about transactions and different strategies and tactics, but a lot of times we miss the big picture of the ecosystem. So today's talk, what I hope to achieve today is that you find relevancy, whether it's as a citizen, whether it's a corporate real estate or commercial real estate professional, but also as a participant in a city of some sort, right? Everyone on this call probably lives near or close by some sort of medium to large city, right, across the Midwest. And what's going on right now, and what I find myself in is spending a lot more time in city halls, discussing how we get out of this mess that's been largely created by the impact of changing office demand, workplace demand, but also a rapidly changing world, right? And so what's going on in many Midwestern cities right now is that office buildings have struggled. There's a shortage of housing. Zoning laws were written 50 to 100 years ago in some cases, and the markets are trying to adapt, find opportunities around that. And it's been very challenging, right? And so the first point I wanted to touch on today, and hopefully everyone can see my screen, is why the hell does this matter, right? You can sit there and say, well, we've gotten rid of all of our old office space. We've gotten, right? What does it matter to me? Or I live out in the suburbs. What does it matter, right? I live in this great bubble of the community. And ultimately, what happens is that our traditional downtowns historically have been huge GDP drivers. And I don't think that's going to stop. However, as those cores start to be impacted and hurt, and where the impacts are just now starting to be felt, is that there's a huge lag from previous valuations to tax assessed values. And we're just starting to see those watermarks reset. And a lot of cities around the country are starting to see revenue pressure because they derive a lot of their property tax revenue from commercial property taxes. So if office on average used to be valued or appraised at $130, $150 a foot in CBD downtowns, whether that's Cincinnati, Ohio, Indianapolis, Columbus, Louisville, et cetera. And now all of a sudden the average has dripped into the 80s or 70s, sometimes 60s, right? Those are massive valuation drops. That not only hurts the investors and the Wall Street banks that made the loans, but it also begins to hurt the local community because as a result, a lot of property tax revenue, and in fact, most cities, majority of the property tax revenue comes from commercial, not from residents, right? And so if you start looking at the headlines, and you're going to start seeing it right now across a lot of cities, and it's easy to gloss this over because it feels boring, talk about municipal budgets, you're seeing them having to scale back and cut back on resources in a lot of areas. Part of that's driven by this dynamic that we're talking about today. The other dynamic is that there's been inflation and all these other factors that have hurt city budgets. So what do we get in return is we get less safe downtowns, right? More blight, more crime. And all those things continue into what we call the doom loop, right? Kind of the point of no return. And all of us can think of cities, especially around the Rust Belt, that once had former glory and are shells of their former selves. I'm not going to call anybody out, right, specifically, but there's cities that you guys can all think of that at one time were great and have since quite fallen pretty dramatically from their peaks maybe 30, 40, 50 years ago. And they've never recovered. And a lot of people wonder why. Well, if you get into this doom loop, it's kind of like spitting out in a car on an icy winter day. Very hard to course correct, right? There's all the old grandpa tricks and the trick your dad taught you, and they usually sometimes work. Sometimes it's just dumb luck that we confuse with skill, right? At the end of the day, that they recover. So that's what we're going to talk about today. But in particular, we're going to talk about those structural challenges as real estate professionals, right? And why they matter, and then what can be done about it. So, I think everyone's familiar, the office market demand profile has shifted. Office demand certainly hasn't gone away, right? And we're continuing to see real strength in leasing amongst trophy class, whether that's the Midwest or nationally. Below trophy class, we've seen a big struggle, right, long term. Some cities, we'll take Indianapolis as a for instance, our downtown has 25% direct vacancy for office inventory of about 13 million square feet. If I take into consideration some of the subleases, et cetera, it's closer to 30%. But for the brand new buildings built within the last 10 years, guess what the vacancy is? 5%, right? So there's a big bifurcation there. Office demand hasn't gone away, it's just changed. The other thing that I think a lot of cities, not every single city in the Midwest, right? The majority of them in the Midwest are facing housing shortages for the first time in a long time. Part of that's driven by just frictional structural issues in the market, right? Zoning laws, things like that, right? Other things like the capital markets, right? Cost of debt being at 15-year highs certainly haven't helped matters. But we're seeing a tremendous amount of demand and resiliency in the residential, both for sale and for rent. But the most important point here is, and this is where it impacts all of us, right? It impacts school systems, it impacts city services, right? Is that as those buildings have faltered and economic activity has eroded in those downtowns, right? Property tax values begin to come down, right? And I've called out a few examples here throughout the Midwest, one in Pittsburgh, one in St. Louis. The St. Louis example is really interesting. This is an office tower in St. Louis that at its peak traded at $205 million. It was fully leased by AT&T. 20 years later, the building traded to Samara Road for $3.6 million, right? Another Indianapolis example, I might touch on it here, is 120 Monument Circle, former headquarters for Anthem. Originally traded kind of turn of 2010 for $150 million. It just sold vacant for $6.3 million on our Monument Circle, right? Basically for the value of the dirt. And so what happens when this occurs is there's a lag, right? So that trade happens, the property's assessed in arrears, right? Meaning you're paying for your tax bill, you're writing the check for this year for last year. You're going to appeal your reassessment as the new owner. And that's when it starts to impact tax rolls. So it's taken us 5 years to begin to start seeing some of the cracks form in commercial property taxes. And this fall, as those budgets go in front of city councils and mayors present them, they're facing a tremendous amount of challenges and shortfalls, not to mention in Ohio and Indiana, some changes at the state level as it relates to what municipal governments are able to, how they're able to fund things, also how they're able to levy property taxes. Indiana has retroactively basically put a base year in 2019. Ohio was contemplating eliminating all commercial property taxes with the state legislator. And so these are causing major impacts to municipalities at the local level, right? And the risk here is that it creates these budgets that are constrained and really ties hands behind the backs of what municipal can do to support conversions and kind of avoiding the doom loop. So what is driving this? I think, no one on this call is going to be necessarily surprised, right? Everyone's read about the strength of residential, whether that's for sale, for rent, or somewhere in between. Those have continued to outpace most markets with a few exceptions here and there, where maybe multifamily got a little oversupplied or residential still has amount of inventory. And so as you look at it, there's still tremendous amount of demand. However, construction costs have been high. pulling off these conversions, although sounds great on paper and in a news article, is actually quite challenging, having worked on a number of these projects over the last 10 years. And so we still see positive demand for residential, right? Meanwhile, we have vacant office space that's not generating as much revenue and tax potential, right? How do we start connecting these? Makes it really difficult. That being said, in certain cities, we've seen a boom of conversions starting to occur, right? They're still very difficult, but overall, I put together some data here on this slide that shows kind of key cities across the Midwest, who's doing well and who's not when it ranks from a conversion standpoint. Chicago is kind of an anomaly due to the size of the market, but it's in the Midwest, so I include it. Obviously, they're leading the charge, but surprisingly, Cleveland, Ohio is number 2, not far off of Chicago with total inventory coming online of conversions, right? And they have a few large notable conversions that are in the works at the moment. Kansas City, Minneapolis, Detroit, Columbus all make the list, and then Milwaukee. Indianapolis is far lagging this, right? Considerably when I think about, looking at its peer set. In addition, Cincinnati had a fairly negligible amount of conversion activity, same with Louisville. So obviously there's a little bit of lagging depending on the markets, and there's a lot of reasons, right? Zoning is so localized, it's hard to give you a blanket statement as to why these factors, because each city has its own distinct zoning. But naturally what we're seeing is there's still a lot of friction in the zoning, regardless of what city we talk about. But secondly, it's also very challenging to find the right type of projects, but they can be successful. So I'll skip over the notable Indianapolis projects because we're taking a broader brush here. But there's really 4 key factors that kind of work in tandem to make a conversion work. And why this could be also important as a corporate real estate professional is many of you maybe have had to dispose of older office buildings, right, as part of it, and start thinking about how do we do this. And so my job as an advisor has been spending a lot of time looking at alternative uses to maximize value on behalf of our corporate clients. And so for an office conversion to say, okay, Andrew, what makes a building convertible, right? At the end of the day, what are the attributes? These are the 4. One is cost basis, right? So that's one thing we all have to be considered about. You go, this could be this luxury apartment building very easily. Well, that developer needs to buy it at the right cost, right? That's somewhat intuitive, but in the Midwest, typically that means a valuation between $20 and $40 a foot, right? That's pretty low when you consider the cost of construction, right? And the cost of replacement, right? And that's a little jarring for some people, but between $20 and $40 a foot, depending on the market, depending on the location, depending on the multifamily rents, right? Of course, I have to caveat it because location matters. It's around $20 to $40 a foot, just rough take, depends on the building. The other thing is floor plate size, right? And the architects on this call will intuitively understand this, right? To take something that was meant to be an office building, make it livable, habitual, and also attractive to tenants or condo owners, you have to have good window line, you have to have great views, right? So not every building's floor plate is conducive to that. The larger the floor plate, oftentimes much more challenging. The sweet spot size historically has been somewhere between 7 and 15,000 square feet, and typically a long, narrow rectangle. Older style buildings, right, from kind of the 20s, 30s, about 100 years old, tend to have the floor plates that work. Problem is, sometimes you run into other problems with an older building, so it's not a panacea. Second is, obviously, this is real estate. Location matters. We all know that. But the final piece of the puzzle where we've seen over the last 2 or 3 years that volume pick up when I showed those benchmarks is public sector participation. When the pandemic happened and some buildings were coming to market for conversions, a lot of the local municipalities didn't know how to incentivize and kind of support these projects, right? A lot was really unknown about the economics and how it worked. Very few conversions historically had happened in Midwest cities outside of Chicago. They were more opportunistic or creative class. And we're just now starting to see kind of a development community and also the zoning offices, city planning, et cetera, begin to put into place programs to help support developers and also give their city councils clear program guidelines to judge projects, where before you were kind of a bit of a pioneer coming into City Hall asking for public support. On top of this, right? Each city is going through its own politics right now, and I'll talk about that as it relates to affordable housing, housing ratios, how they incentivize those projects, right? And sometimes there's other structural issues that start getting into play, right? Well-meaning legislation, but in practice in the private market, it becomes more challenging. I'll talk about some of those factors, but these are the four kind of key boxes that need to be checked just to have a project that may be economically viable. So when I talk about public sector support, right, this topic is extremely controversial right now, right? A lot of citizens, rightfully so, you know, for good or bad reasons, feel that these are handouts to wealthy private developers, right? And that these projects can stand on their own, right? These are taxpayer money, right? Essentially either through abatement, right? Foregoing future property taxes, or via TIF, tax increment financing, basically creating a bond out of future property tax revenue streams, handing that over to the developer, are handouts and giveaways. Certainly there are real cases and examples of that, but when projects are no longer economically viable in the private market, the alternative here is that the city and the citizens really either invest in these projects or they don't. And the key that's really difficult right now to explain to elected officials is the burning platform as to why, if you don't do this today, what happens 5 or 10 years from now, right? And for many cases, for elected officials, they're thinking about being out of that office in 5 to 10 years because usually they have broader aspirations. So that consequence isn't always, right, very linear, right? It's not like your pet is going to die tomorrow, right? It's going to die in 10 years. So your downtown, the decisions this council makes today will have an impact 10 years from now on property tax revenue. The problem being is a lot of the politicians don't plan on being around that long or worried about their next reelection cycle. So it's really up to citizens, right, to support these type of programs, right, and to advocate for them in their communities, because I'm telling you right now, the city councilors are very self-motivated. But here are kind of 4 examples, right? Each state has their own taxation system, so it's hard to sit there and say, what's a broad brush? Chicago historically uses tax increment financing. Indianapolis, the city of Indianapolis, uses property tax abatement. TIF financing, although they use it, it's not being used as much on the conversion projects. St. Louis, who's probably the one downtown in the greater Midwest that's kind of in that doom loop already, right? And that's been well publicized. It's not just me saying that. They're using historic tax credit programs. Indiana has a similar program. However, there's a $35 million annual cap on it statewide. So oftentimes timing becomes a concern. But Columbus, Ohio and Ohio are experimenting with historical tax credit programs as well, which helps defray some of these costs. We see the best programs where there's a state program, a local municipal program that can be stacked upon each other. Have the state share in that kind of responsibility, but also the municipality. That being said, more is trying to be done with the zoning laws, because that, we could solve the capital stack equation. Sometimes solving zoning processes and codes can also be a big part of it. And those are harder to change, quite frankly, because those are legislative. But we're starting to see cities kind of wake up to this and start debuting programs. Some of you may be seeing more articles in your local newspapers about it because it is so important. So what is the doom loop, right? And why is it so important, right? And we talk about this a lot with public officials because sometimes they don't live in our world to understand how slow commercial real estate can be and how by the time there's a problem, it's sometimes too late because the solution may be years off. And so it's really a vicious cycle, right? It starts with high vacancies, the property values go down, lower taxes into the city coffers, they have to reduce services, downtowns become less safe, there's more blight, there's more broken glass storefronts, there's less downtown appeal, people don't go to the restaurants close up, and pretty soon you have tumbleweeds down your main street, right? And it's a period that can happen in 5 to 7 years if you're not careful. And also it makes the GDP of the area, right? It hurts job growth, it hurts educational opportunities, et cetera. That is kind of the what's at stake here. that we're trying to raise awareness of, because if we don't do things today, in 5 years, that problem becomes exponentially more expensive and harder to get out of it, right? And I guess I will use an example. Gary, Indiana is a great example of this, or Youngstown, Ohio, right? It's very difficult for those communities right now to figure out the way out, right? Once the doom loop has started, right? And so the other aspect here is retail, right? And the reason I'm going to touch on retail is A, it provides an amenity to office tenants. B, it also helps attract and retain people and foot traffic downtown, which is good for economic activity. We have a saying in this business that says activity breeds activity in commercial real estate. And so retailers are also having a similar issue. Their issue is that footfall and foot traffic in these downtowns isn't consistent. A lot of cities have done a lot to support sports entertainment, which is great, but obviously that's variable foot traffic, right? The goal here is to get more consistent daily foot traffic. The most linear way we see kind of these downtowns getting out of it is to improve their demographics through permanent residents, whether that's for rent or for sale, because bringing office tenants back when office demand has cyclically shifted is going to be challenging, right? And so we're seeing a lot more public-private partnerships trying to support small entrepreneurs and really do pop-ups and storefronts, but also starting to rethink retail and how it fits within residential. And we know that if you have the residential right, you have the retail right, you get the office workers in those mixed use districts. But it takes a lot of zoning to make that happen. And also it takes entrepreneurship, but also some public support. So a couple key takeaways, right, for today. And obviously I'm trying to make sure we leave some time for questions here at the end. A couple of things I always kind of leave people with, right, is one is office distress. We're continuing to work through that cycle. We're still in the thick of it. It's not going away, right? So this is more of a structural demand issue. So some of the demand profile that I talked about with office, it's still there, but it's being shifted amongst different class of buildings, and the functionally obsolete buildings are more evident and they need to be addressed, right? Both with private developers, but also public support and participation. And that doesn't always mean dollars. That could mean cooperative zoning. Secondly, conversions. Those programs need to continue to going forward, and they probably aren't going far enough. There needs to be ways to make fast pass for zoning. Chicago is trying to pilot this program right now to make their zoning process a lot easier for developers to navigate for conversions. Downtown retail is going to continue to be an important point to judge our performance here, because if retail can survive, right, it means there's enough residents and demographics that other uses like office can be reactivated. And the final piece, right, is that municipal participation in action is essential here, right? And so it's really easy to sit there and say, hey, I live in the burbs. They shouldn't, right? This isn't my problem to have. But we all have a duty to kind of support and think about these things, because a stronger property tax base, in particular for commercial, guess what? It helps keep residential taxes in check, right? Secondly, it also has a safer, more vibrant economy. Therefore, there's more job opportunities, both for yourselves, children, family members, et cetera. And remember, activity breeds activity. And so, those are the kind of the key takeaways. At the end of the day, I think a lot of progress has been made, right? If you see the number of conversions that are kind of slated across the Midwest, I think that's a huge improvement from 5 years ago. That being said, there's still a lot of vacant, distressed buildings that are going to need to be addressed over the next 5 to 7 years, right? And having those programs in place and having awareness around the challenges around those programs are going to be critical. And also for corporate real estate, if you occupy those downtowns, if you're a participant in those economies, you want to see a vibrant downtown, because it's a better workplace experience. You're going to have an easier time attracting and retaining talent, et cetera, right? So we also have a corporate vested interest in making sure our downtowns remain vibrant, because ultimately our corporation will benefit both directly and indirectly. So I'll pause there, leave a couple minutes for questions.
Andrew, this was awesome. I'm gonna selfishly thinking about Louisville. We have, as you know, a very large 27-floor Michael Graves building that's about to be vacated. Looking at the slide here and what you were talking about, what would come first, right? So you take this building, right? Some company wants to come in and redevelop the Humana Tower. What has to happen first? Is it the zoning? Is it the company that wants to invest the money in taking an office tower and making an apartment building? Is it a grocery store that wants to bring, a huge kind of tenant to downtown Louisville? Is it like what's the first domino that would have to fall to make this all to a conversion of this sort take place?
Yeah, that's a great question, Chad. I think, the two things you need first, right? You need a building, right? So sounds like we got that. Sounds like maybe there's developers, right, with the gumption and entrepreneurial experience, right, to be able to potentially pull this off and capitalize it and finance it. Typically, that developer should be qualified and having done something similar before, right, or tangential, because conversions are just tricky, right? Not every developer can do these. Second, but the most important piece is beginning to work with municipality, right? Because there's a lot of layers there that we're going to need their participation on. Zoning being one of them, right? Secondly, right, understanding what programs available, because the alternative path here, right, and this is what we talk about with a lot of cities to make them kind of come to the table is, hey, we're selling this building. We want this to be a property tax asset, not a property tax burden. Ultimately, at the end of the day, we have a developer that's interested. We've entered definitive kind of purchase terms potentially with contingencies, and we need the city of Louisville in this case to work with us to A, come up with an incentives program, but B, also, right, work with zoning professionals to help usher this through. And it really works when all three parties are at the table, developer, seller, and the city, and sometimes the state as well as Commonwealth of Kentucky, to figure out how to make this happen. Because there's a number of ways, right, that this project can go off the rails really quick, right? Costs will be one of them, zoning will be another, financing will be another. So we're trying to control for as many of those variables as possible. And a lot of times too, what we've done is kind of come up with creative financing solutions, right? Partially maybe corporate seller financing, JV participation, right? Adding that to the capital stack to make other aspects of those, right, more easy to finance, but secondly, also showing the community that in, a case like, hey, I'm just making things up, but hey, Humana is a partner in this deal, right? And we're going to be exited over time. So it's not just a developer asking, it's also Humana, right? We're trying to do what's right for the community here. City, you need to do the same thing, right? You need to mirror us. We're coming together as partners, and we want you to be the third partner in our soiree. That we've done that a number of times recently, and that's been a very successful piece because there's politics there that they can use from an optics standpoint to say, hey, this is beyond just us funding a developer, right? There's a bigger picture here, right? There's a kind of a corporate community spirit that we don't want to push away. That being said, it's all about politics, and navigating that for each particular case is kind of complex, right? So, it relies on having good relationships with those elected officials to be able to have those frank conversations at the right level.
Yeah, that makes sense. Appreciate the insights. Who else has questions for Andrew? Questions, comments? Must be testament to a really good presentation, Andrew.
I guess so. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I appreciate it. Hopefully it's been informative. We can send this deck out. Heidi and Brady, I think I sent it to you last week. So I'd love to get it to the group. And as always, if anyone wants to connect offline, I have my contact information here. Happy to talk through it. We're active on a number of these projects across the Midwest right now, and happy to lend any expertise or kind of tips and tricks that might be helpful to you. And I appreciate everyone's time and attention today. I hope you all have a great day.
Andrew, do you want to promote your podcast?
Oh yeah, that's right. I do have a podcast that talks about a lot of this, as well as a blog. It's all here in the deck, QR code as well, Urban Foundry. We also have a Substack where I kind of write a quarterly magazine style article about different commercial real estate topics, whether they're global, local. And so it should be a lot of fun if you're interested in learning about more of this kind of stuff. Also hearing from, I have a lot of the politicians on to talk about the different programs and how things work in the municipal world and how we broker these public-private partnerships.
Awesome.
Fantastic.
All right.
Andrew, thank you.
Thanks,
Appreciate everyone joining today.
You got
Y'all
it.
have a good day.
Thanks, everybody.